is changing everything so quickly that even the contributions that I summed up 3 or 4 years ago are now largely overtaken by what they're planning, and it's vast, it's massive scale. So I just want to give you a sense of that and leave you with that as for the planning challenges. So when we look at what's coming for Frankston, it's really part of a massive change to the urban structure and the functioning of the city of Melbourne, the whole metropolitan area. Because the government's planning a whole-scale reconstruction of much of the established city, particularly concentrating on the middle ring suburbs and the nominated established outer areas such as Frankston. And that's very difficult to get around, and I just want to sum up what that is made up of soon. But it's the method that is also a big concern here, because it's being introduced by stealth. The government's making really radical changes to the entire planning system, and they're bringing these changes through planning scheme amendments, applying right across the city and other policies without any consultation with residents or local government. In fact, the entire approach that they've adopted is designed to exclude residents and local government, and really residents, we're all regarded as the enemy. And it's just picking something Rob set up, that we get a much better city through a participating populace. We've got ideas, there's incredible knowledge and experience in every community, and we end up with a much better and looking, functioning and high amenity city that meets all the targets if we're all involved. But the government has decided that that's not the way it's going to happen. So let me just run through some of the key elements of what they're doing, and then we'll conclude. So let's look at the housing targets. Rob mentioned these quickly, but the government's imposed housing targets on all Victorian councils, and it wants 2.2 million more houses by 2051, and 800,000 by 2034. Now, the really interesting thing about this, it's not a planned approach in the sense that Rob Adams was talking about. What they're trying to do is to fundamentally change vast areas, particularly with the middle ring suburbs and some of the outer urban areas. If this was planned, as Rob was talking about, it can be done rationally, and there are various ways to do this. If we're all involved, and a much better system would be to have regional groupings of councils with residents intricately involved with the development community and government to work out the rules for development and the location. So what can go where? Now, I don't think that's too much to expect, and we know from all sorts of experience over the world you get a much better response if a process of participation like that was the method of achieving increased population, to work out together what is most appropriate in what locations. But the government hasn't done that. It's imposed these targets. It's obsessed with supply. It just thinks if the government can open up vast areas of the established area of Melbourne to development, then the problem will be solved because developers will then come in and develop these sites to the rules that they construct themselves. The developers will make the rules, not because the government's getting out of that space. So the government is obsessed with supply, and it's put out a narrative that is particularly perfidious. It says there has been a lack of housing supply. That's because councils haven't approved enough houses, and that's because residents and Indies, and they're selfish and they put pressure on councils. And so the answer to that is to remove planning controls and to centralise the rules with government and then open it up to the development industry. Now, every element of that narrative is false, and I'm not going to go into the detail too much, but every year from 2005 to 2022, more houses were approved than there was the demand. The supply exceeded the demand. This business that the government and the development community have put out, that there's been a missing middle in the middle-wing suburbs, and there's been a lack of action in places like Frankston, is completely false. More development, twice as many multi-unit development units of housing units have been constructed in the middle ring and established suburbs like Frankston than the vast high-rise areas in the inner city and the city of Melbourne and the big brownfield areas there. So that's false. And of course, councils have approved far more development applications than has been needed, and there's a lot of vacant, there's a lot of development applications and approvals that have not been built on. Developers they don't oversupply at all. They never will, because that will lead to housing price falling. They always just produce less than the demand, and that's the business model. So councils have been busy approving vast numbers of housing approvals, but the development industry has the opportunity and makes the decision about how many to take up. And the problems in recent years from 2022 to recently have not been because councils haven't approved the applications, it's because the development industry itself has had major problems in supply of materials, in housing, in financing, internet and international supply chains, and labour problems. So, and in fact, the approval numbers are coming back up, but developers just didn't make the same number of housing applications because they knew they couldn't actually develop the housing that they really would like to do. So in the 30 years to 2021, housing in Melbourne's 15 inner and middle ring suburbs increased by 55%, 318,000 new dwellings, and most of them were high and medium and high-rise developments and high-density developments. So that's one approach the government's taking, just apply these housing targets and then open up the entire system to the development industry. A second approach is the redevelopment of activity centres, and that is essentially important to you. The developers, as Rob said, the government has nominated 10 activity centres. Frankston's one as metropolitan activity centres. Now, the interesting thing is it's formulating plans for these activity centres themselves. There are structure plans, and you're going through, and your council and yourselves have been going through this structure plan process for Frankston. But the development is the final development rules are going to be decided by the government. And what that means for council structure plans is really interesting, because councils have been all over Melbourne developing structure plans for such activity centres such as these and others, and they're being already overruled by the government as insufficient. So it's likely that whatever comes out of the structure plan process that you're being involved in is going to change. The government is going to develop the rules and the councils are going to have to implement them, and you're not going to have much say about it, if any, at all. So if we look at just the Box Hill approach just as an example of what might happen. Oh, by the way, you can look at the government maps. You can go into the activity centre program for the government, look up Frankston, and you can see the maps for the activity centres, and they are quite extensive. the government area for Frankston is large. It's very large. It's not just the existing activity centre itself. It's not just the shopping centre. It extends further than that, quite significantly further. So you can see these maps, but there's no rules yet. So you can't actually see what the government has in mind. But generally they're talking about an 800 metre radius, and I think it's going to be significantly more in certain areas. So we look at Box Hill. Box Hill, of course, the council had a mature planning for Box Hill. It's a bit different from Frankston because it's going to be a precinct for the suburban rail. But I think it does. What's happening there does have very dire implications for Frankston and the other 10 and many other major activity centres, metropolitan and major activity centres. So the government sort of put out these three types of development, all quite intense, and of course with the recent development that you probably saw a week or so ago, the government actually approved far beyond what the council structure plan provided and what they originally put out in these original documents. They put out a draft precincts vision statement. I love these kind of terms. This is the government's vision, and it initially suggested development of up to 20 stories, but then the planning minister comes in and overrides all that suggested heights and so on, with a massive 7-tower approval ranging from 19 to 50 stories for 1,700 dwellings in the Box Hill Central Precinct. Now, this model, we've got to face the fact that it may not be 50 stories, it may not be 80 stories, it may hover around 20, 30, 40 stories for centres like Frankston, but it's going to be high-rise, and it's going to be significant. And if you can imagine 1,700 people coming into Box Hill on top of the high-rise that's already there and what's going to come, there's no additional facilities, there's no additional open space. In fact, they've pinched the open space for the suburban rail loop. So this leaves a legacy of major problems for the activity centres, because there's going to be significant increased population. It's going to be high-rise to medium to high-rise, and it's not going to bring along the services, infrastructure and amenity that we would expect. And finally, there's a lot more, but we don't have time to go through all the elements of the government's proposal, but the final one is the Future Homes program for apartments. Now, this also has significant implications for Frankston, because what the government's proposing here is to allow the redevelopment of all land in the main residential zone, the general residential zone, statewide. So any general residential land in Frankston and around, not just around the centre of the town, but in the suburban areas outside this, within 800 metres of a passenger railway station, will be able to be redeveloped according to standardised apartment designs, and they're originally proposing within the original height limits somewhere around 3 stories, and they've found that doesn't work economically. Developers are not interested. So they've already proposed 4 to 5 stories, and it's going to go higher than that. So, and this is without a permit. This is what's known as code assessed. They just put up a series of apartment standards. If the development meets those standards, it can go ahead, and there's no advertising, there's no approval necessary in the sense of a permit under the current planning regime. And this 800 metre radius is going to extend theoretically across every activity centre, every neighbourhood, every shopping centre across the established area of Melbourne. And when you look at the map, this is mapped also. You can just get into the website and look up maps for the Future Homes program if you're interested, and I know you will be. but it includes a vast area of Frankston, right? Central Frankston, Frankston North and South, Coringle, Carron, right up to Carron Downs, Mount Eliza, all along the Bean Highway, right along the coast. And this will not be three-storey development. It's going to be significantly higher than 3 stories, and it will be without the normal planning process being applied. So just to finish up, there's a lot more to be said about the planning processes, but a lot of it comes back also to this development facilitation obsession that the government has. As I said before, the government's answer is to open up supply everywhere, or in many places as they can, and take away the rules. And that implies then you have a very centralised model where the government makes the rules. It's doing that at the moment around the suburban rail precincts, and it's doing it for the major activity centres like Frankston. But this development facilitation program is even more insidious than the processes I've talked about, because it's a totally different fast-track approvals, separate approvals process where a developer can make an application direct to the minister which overrides the current planning arrangements. So that process will be increasingly used by developers because it's there. It's going to be opened up. So to finish up, if we just go back to some of Rob Adams's criteria and just quickly try to apply this to those local character density, high quality public realm and public participation. So we just look at local character. I mean, it's absolutely critical that any redevelopment in and around Frankston respects the attributes that make Frankston an interesting and valuable place to live. For example, the coastal environment is one classic with the high-rise down there. So what's happening there is high-rise will privatise a public amenity and fundamentally change the environment for everybody not living in that development. So a local characteristic should be respected. You don't need high density, high rise or even medium rise 12-storey developments to get increased density. It can be done in many ways. Rob Adams's approach has merit. I think it certainly didn't protect the heritage overlay areas enough, and if you go up through Brunswick and up Lygon Street and so on, it took me recently an hour on a Saturday morning to get from Thornbury to Fitzroy through that area, because there's so much development along those routes. The crosstown routes, everybody's trying to get cross town in their cars, and they're narrow streets. You can't even get 2 cars through those streets. So there are really important ways to get higher density, and we've got to figure them out together. And can be done. At RMIT a few years ago, we modelled how you could get a city of 8 million people in the existing area of Melbourne without expanding it further out into the corridors, and while keeping every heritage building, heritage overlay, and high amenity heritage and environmentally valuable environments. And we found you can do it under the existing zones. Right? It can be done, but it's called planning. And it's really needs to involve all of us in it. High quality public realm that Rob mentioned, amenity is absolutely critical. That is nice, livable places. Places that we value, right? They can be environmentally, high heritage, or just enjoyable places to live. And if we look at retailing, for example, retailing in Frankston, it's not just a matter of lack of density for development. I mean, retailing all over Melbourne has been smashed. Why? Because government doesn't have a retail policy. It took away any policy intervention, and it allowed all the big retailers to open up retail stores, big box stores and malls away from the shopping centres. Frankston's competing against big box centres all over the place, and malls. People drive to these away from the centre. And by the way, the council rezoned other areas to the north to allow further big box centres. So the centre of Frankston hasn't had a chance in a retail sense to compete with that. And back to Rob Adams' point about the centre of Melbourne, 20 years ago people were giving up on small retailing in Melbourne, said it wasn't going to happen, and then all of a sudden it started to happen. All the small streets, Little Collins Street, Burke Street, Collins Street, there suddenly wasn't enough, there weren't enough small shops. Every single shop was taken up with high-end fashion. Right? It came back because of high amenity. People wanted the small, old heritage shops. They didn't want to go into those big areas that are closed off from the street. But as far as Frankston's concerned, that's where you've got to go, because the people that are selling everything virtually other than coffee, maybe, and the odd restaurant, and professional services, you can have your nails done, you can go and get your tax return done, but anything else you've got to get in a car and go and buy your paper from an office works, or you've got to go up to a big retail mall. So this is simply a matter of planning, it's a matter of working together with communities to figure out how to achieve the proper responses to the pressures of population that are coming our way. And regrettably, government is shutting us all out, it's shutting communities out, and it's locking local governments out. And we're going to see a city, unless this is changed by community pressure, we're going to see a city that is fundamentally altered and turn more into a sort of Asian mega city type development, totally unnecessarily.
Thank you.
So that's it.
Thank you, Michael, and I know some of the things you've said probably are controversial, but that's the purpose of this forum, so that people can listen to what's being said, and if it makes you think and you get involved, then that's an ideal outcome. Michael has agreed to take questions. We've probably got about 7 or 8 minutes, so any questions anywhere? There's one here. Microphone people. Max, are you there?
Thank you. My question is, more and more VCAT seems to not stick up, represent, or be a place where the average person